So I was eating my antioxidant-rich kiwi this morning for breakfast, minding my own business. And Kim said, "Hey, how are you feeling about this morning?" And I said what I always say when she asks that question, because she's kind. She asks a question, I always say, not because of seeing you, but I just, you never know what the sermon work is going to be like until you get to the sermon time. And so I said, I feel kind of And she said, well, it's Daniel 3. That's a great passage. That's about the three guys in the fiery furnace, if you know the story. And I said, yeah. She's like, and it's also Mission Sunday, so how are you going to tie that together? And she's like, maybe, go to the mission field or else. And I thought, well, that will preach, but not very well, not very accurately. And that was the end of our conversation. And so I'm sure my next breakfast next Sunday will be more quiet. Follow me for marriage tips. But Daniel 3 is an important story in Scripture, both for the Old Testament, for the New Testament, because it reminds us that in Babylon, living out biblical faithfulness tells the good news of a God who always saves his people. It's a story that took place in actual Babylon about 600 years before Jesus was born. But as we've seen over the previous weeks, the Bible uses Babylon both as an actual description of a real place and also as a metaphoric description of the world order that is opposed to God and to his rule. So there is a way in which God's people are always living in Babylon. And what we learn this morning as we move through the passage is that mission always happens when Jesus' followers live biblically faithful lives before an unbelieving world. And I want you to think about that, because as you hear from the missions team and as you think about mission, and God might be calling you to further engagement, and that might be true because it is certainly something that God does call men and women to go cross-culturally to share the good news about Jesus in all kinds of ways, and we've heard some of them this morning. But it is also true that we are all called to be missionaries where we are. And one of the ways where we are missionaries right now is by living biblically faithful lives. Now, I thought to say, when I was working on the sermon, that living with spiritual integrity is missional, but that's too vague, because in Babylon, spirituality is welcome. Babylon can be a very spiritual place. The practices of a variety of different faiths are welcome in Babylon. And I thought to say that believing biblical truth is missional, but that didn't quite satisfy either, because Babylon is not challenged by what you believe privately in the quiet place of your heart. Babylon is challenged when what you believe changes how you live on the outside. And that's where biblical faithfulness becomes missional, if you will, where it tells the story about people who Jesus has brought into a new kingdom. And for this past weeks or so, we've underscored that Christians hold dual citizenship, where Christians are citizens of the place in which God has placed us. We're citizens of the heavenly realm into which God has saved us. Sometimes there are moments where both citizenships seem compatible. Sometimes they come into conflict. And the challenge is to live out biblical faithfulness when faithfulness comes into conflict with the other kingdom. That's the story of Daniel 3. Daniel 3 contains great truths for us, especially when living biblically faithful lives brings us into conflict with the Babylon into which God has placed us. So let's look at the story. You'll be helped, if you do have a Bible, by having it open. I don't mean to be facetious. I mean, it's a long story, and you're going to want to read along. That's like, they write that one down for the staff meeting. All right. Live missionally, first of all, by deciphering Babylon's agenda. In Babylon, and here I'm speaking metaphorically and actually, there are seasons where true faith in the real God and acceptance, even promotion in Babylon, are possible and compatible. Daniel in chapter 2 reported and interpreted the king's dream. High honors and great gifts followed. Anything we can do for you, Daniel. Daniel 2, verse 49. Daniel made a request of the king, and the king appointed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the affairs of the province of Babylon. But Daniel remained at the king's court. So these are the three friends of Daniel. They went through their internship together. They were welcomed into Nebuchadnezzar's service. And now at the end of Daniel's interpretation of the king's dream, they are all promoted. There is a moment in Babylon where biblical faithfulness, if not widely accepted, was at least culturally tolerated. There was a moment where Daniel would have been the man of the hour. Chapter 3 changes that. And I think understanding the change and appreciating the change is helpful for us, because I think that we have been living through that same change in our earthly homeland. When I was a student, so I'm thinking of, college time, some time ago, 89 to 93 for me. When I was a student and a Christian, it was socially okay to be a sincere Christian. It was weird, but it was socially okay. My grandparents' generation experienced even more acceptance. And we could have a conversation about to the extent of whether it was cultural Christianity or sincere faithfulness, and that's only what God knows. But there have been eras in our nation's history where church membership was expected, where worship attendance was viewed positively, where church relationships could broker commercial relationships. Not so much anymore. And if you're my age or a little bit older, then you should appreciate that primarily the student generation is experiencing this. NPC students describe a big paradigm shift, very noticeable. They've said after the country reopened, following the COVID lockdown, where it became more costly to identify as a Christian, more costly to attend student Christian groups. And deciphering Babylon's agenda helps explain this shift, explains why this happened. So look at verse 1 of chapter 3 in your very open Bibles. King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold whose height was 60 cubits and its breadth 6 cubits. So 90 feet high, 9 feet wide. He set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar's statue-making program occurred after Daniel revealed and interpreted his dream, sometime later. After God's mercy to Daniel caused Daniel to show mercy to the Babylonian wise men, after Daniel's rewards, after the promotion of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So after that positive moment at the end of chapter 2, hey, Daniel, you're the guy. Now, chapter 3 starts. Then King Nebuchadnezzar sent to gather the satraps. We're only going to do this one time. The satraps, the prefects, and the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces to come to the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. So the whole government is now invited to Nebuchadnezzar's worship service. And then all of the guys, verse 3, gathered. And they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And the herald proclaimed aloud, "You are commanded, O peoples, nations, and languages, that when you hear the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, you are to fall down and worship the golden image that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately be cast into a burning fiery furnace. Therefore, as soon as all the peoples heard the sound of all of the instruments, they fell down and worshiped the golden image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. What's Nebuchadnezzar's agenda? Well, the statue's location actually is a good clue to Nebuchadnezzar's agenda. The plain of Dura in Babylon is in the region of Shinar, where very many years ago, the first Babylers built a tower. Do you remember that story from Genesis chapter 11? Then the whole earth had one language and the same words. And as people migrated from the east, they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. Then they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens. And let us make a name for ourselves. Let us be dispersed over the face of the whole earth." So the agenda of the first people to build a tall object on the plain of Dura was this: unity lest we be dispersed. Let's make a name for ourselves. We'll climb up to heaven, they were thinking. So there's a quest to control spirituality on human terms, all of which rebels against God's original command to humanity in Genesis chapter 1, where God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it." You can't fill the earth and subdue it if you're not going into the earth. And so what might at first glance look just like an interesting construction project is actually in Genesis 11 the epitome of human rebellion. We're going to establish that humanity is in control of the agenda of all things that are happening on this planet. Flash forward to the same spot 1,000 years later, more or less, several thousand years perhaps. Nebuchadnezzar is doing the exact same thing. God had showed him in his dream in chapter 2 a statue that was made of gold, and then silver, and then bronze, and then iron. And if you were here last week, you know that statue represented 4 kingdoms. And God, through Daniel, had told Nebuchadnezzar, "You're the head of gold. Your kingdom is beautiful, but it won't endure." Nebuchadnezzar took that revelation from God, and he must have pondered it, and now he's actually rebelling against it. Because if he was trying to represent what God has told him, he might have built a statue with those 4 different materials in it. But instead, he makes an all-gold statue. The statue reveals his agenda, that what he's after is an indivisible, universal kingdom. And he summons all of the government of all of the regions. And everyone comes, and it's not voluntary. Come to the dedication of the idol. It's actually a worship service. You're to fall down and worship the golden image that the king has set up. And if you do not worship the idol, you will die. It's coercive state power. History is full of this. And it's fueled by pride. Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves. Here's the thing. In Babylon, real and metaphorical, the agenda is always the same. The agenda is the same. The players change. Resist God's revelation. make names for ourselves, control our own destinies, manipulate spirituality. That's Babylon's agenda. That was Babylon's agenda in Genesis 11. That's Babylon's agenda in Daniel 3. That's Babylon's agenda wherever Babylon is. And so you need to understand Babylon's agenda if you're going to live missionally in Babylon. Because ultimately, Babylon will not tolerate challenges to its agenda. Which means that if you are going to live missionally, you're going to need to prepare for Babylon's anger. Beginning in verse 8 of chapter 3. Therefore, at that time, certain Chaldeans came forward and maliciously accused the Jews. This word malicious it's very picturesque in the language. We made pizza on Friday, which is only to remind you that lunchtime is soon. But we made pizza on Friday. We started the dough in the morning, and you're making the dough and you're pinching it and you're breaking it. That's what the word describes. They were pinching, they were breaking, they were gnawing. The Chaldeans were gnawing at the Jews. Now, possibly some of these men were the very same men that had been saved previously by Daniel's intervention. Babylon has a short-term memory. And now, possibly motivated by jealousy, possibly motivated by their own sincere adoption of Nebuchadnezzar's plan, possibly just going where the wind was blowing, possibly with a more basic hatred of God's people, they declared to King Nebuchadnezzar, "O king, live forever. You, O king, have made a decree that every man who hears the sounds of all of these instruments shall fall down and worship the golden image. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast into a burning fiery furnace. There are certain Jews whom you've appointed over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, pay no attention to you." Do you think that's true? Do you think they really paid no attention to Nebuchadnezzar? They couldn't have stayed in their jobs very long if they did. Babylon spins, "These men, O king, pay no attention to you. They do not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you've set up." Then Nebuchadnezzar, in furious rage, commanded that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought. So they brought these men before the king. Pause. What do you think the time was like for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego between hearing the edict, the summons to the worship service, and then the summons to the king to answer the question about why they didn't participate in the worship service? What do you think that was like? How anxiety-producing might that have been? How prayerful a time might that have been? What are we going to do when we have to give account for not going along with Babylon's agenda? Nebuchadnezzar said to them, "Is it true, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the golden image that I have set up? Now, if you are ready, because I'm sure you've given this some thought, when you hear the sound of all the instruments, fall down and worship the image that I have made, well and good. But if you do not worship, you shall immediately be cast into a burning fiery furnace. And who is the God who will deliver you out of my hands?" I'm sure you boys have thought this through. I'm sure we've just had a failure to communicate. Perhaps, on reflection, you'd like to just bow down. That's all I'm asking. It's just a bow down. This is a far way for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego from the days when they were honored and promoted. For Nebuchadnezzar, this is a big step backwards from the end of chapter 2 to Daniel. Truly, your God is God of gods and Lord of kings. I was struck by a comment from a long ago pastor named Matthew Henry about Nebuchadnezzar's change of tune. Henry says this: strong convictions often come short of a sound conversion. Having a strong religious experience, having an intense and even animating thought about God is far different than being changed by God from the inside out. Why the anger? Well, because Nebuchadnezzar has made an idol of his agenda. And for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to not comply with his agenda is to not comply with the thing that Nebuchadnezzar holds nearest and dearest to his heart. In Babylon, when it comes to the point where you can't go along with Babylon's nearest and dearest dreams, you risk the fury of a scorned lover. Surely you understand, some of you will have experienced that this exists in our Babylon. Consider the idols of our culture. There are many. But just for example, our idolization of individual freedom of choice. When you or I suggest that individual choice and human freedom needs to be subordinate to God's law. In other words, that the only way to be truly free and happy is to live according to the revelation of the Maker who made you. When we suggest that, in the face of redefining marriage, in the face of sanctity of life issues, in the face of spreading misinformation, Babylon gets angry because you're scorning the idol. Angry enough that when God's people are of no longer service to Babylon's agenda, Babylon moves on. This is one important difference between Daniel 2 and Daniel 3. In Daniel 2, Daniel could seek aid from God to interpret Nebuchadnezzar's dream without compromising his faith. And this was helpful to Nebuchadnezzar. In Daniel 3, Nebuchadnezzar's decree aims directly at the heart of biblical faith. Hear, O Israel. These men would have heard from infancy onward. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might. And in chapter 5 of Deuteronomy, you shall not make for yourself a carved image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above or that is on earth beneath or that is in the water underneath the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them. The meaning is plain. The application is costly. How do you prepare for Babylon's anger? This is instructive. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego prepare for Nebuchadnezzar's anger by applying what they know of God to the problem that they're in. Daniel 3:16, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If this be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. Full stop. Preparing to live missionally in Babylon, I want you to catch this, whether you're in 5th grade or 50th grade. Preparing for mission in Babylon means attaining the maximal amount of the knowledge of God that you can, so that you're ready to apply what you know of God to the problem that you're in. I don't mean that we all need to become Bible scholars as much as we all need to become practical theologians. That we need to know as much about God as we can, so that at the moment when we're tested, we know who it is that we're relying on. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego knew about God what our forefathers in the faith wrote about God when they said this about God. And as I read this, let me ask you if this is your God. God is the alone fountain of all being, of whom, through whom, and to whom are all things, and has most sovereign dominion over them, to do by them, for them, or upon them, whatsoever he pleases. He is alone foundation of all being, of whom, through whom, and to whom are all things, and has most sovereign dominion over them, to do by them, for them, or upon them, whatsoever he pleases. Is that your God? Is your God that big? Whatsoever he pleases. O king, we don't need to answer you. He will do what he will do. And what he will do is right. Therefore, we will not bow down. After you've deciphered Babylon's agenda, and after you've prepared for Babylon's anger, you can live missionally by trusting God's presence. Then Nebuchadnezzar was filled with fury. This guy. Then Nebuchadnezzar was filled with fury, and the expression of his face was changed against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He ordered the furnace heated up 7 times more than it was usually heated. And he ordered some of the mighty men of his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and to cast them into the burning fiery furnace. Then these men were bound in their cloaks, their tunics, their hats, and their other garments, and they were thrown into the burning fiery furnace. Because the king's order was urgent and the furnace overheated, the flame of the fire killed those men who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell bound into the burning fiery furnace. Isaiah the prophet ministered about 135 years before Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were exiled into Babylon. It's hard to imagine that young men from believing homes would not have known Isaiah's message. As exiles, could they not have taken to heart or even memorized Isaiah 43:2? When you pass through the waters, I will be with you, and through the rivers, they shall not overwhelm you. When you walk through fire, you shall not be burned, and the flame shall not consume you. For I am the Lord your God, the Holy One of Israel, your Savior. I give Egypt as your ransom, Cush and Seba in exchange for you, because you are precious in my eyes and honored, and I love you. I give men in return for you, peoples in exchange for your life. Fear not, for I am with you. It's hard to imagine these men in whatever way they were able to communicate as they're being bound and as they're being taken to the furnace and as they're feeling the radiant heat that's killing the guys around them. They're saying, remember the Isaiah 43:2 thing. We'll pass through the fires, but remember how it goes on, that we're precious and that we're honored and that we're loved. And what is happening to us in Babylon doesn't undo any of that. And now they experience what God through Isaiah spoke. Nebuchadnezzar was astonished and rose up in haste. He jumped out of his seat. And he declared to his counselors, did we not cast 3 men bound into the fire? And they answered and said to the king, true, O king. He answered and said, but I see 4 men unbound, walking in the midst of the fire, and they are not hurt. And the appearance of the 4th is like a son of the gods. I don't think Nebuchadnezzar leapt to his feet because he was rooting for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to pass the test. I think he leapt to his feet because God was with them. And when you're a king who thinks you're God, the presence of the real God is entirely alarming. Now, scholars debate whether or not this is an appearance of God or whether this is an angel, but the point is the same. God is present, and his presence is unsettling to idolaters. Then Nebuchadnezzar came near to the door of the burning fiery furnace. He declared, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out and come here. Then they came out from the fire, and then the government guys gathered together and saw that the fire had not had any power over the bodies of these men. It's interesting. These were the government officials who were coerced to worship Nebuchadnezzar's idol. But they're not coerced to come see Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Because when God works, people want to know who showed up. In Babylon, biblical faithfulness leads to witness because God is with you to save you. But here, and this is where I need to end, even more amazingly, in Babylon, biblical faithfulness witnesses to the God who saves by going through his own fire. The last book of Scripture, which is easy to find in your Bible because it's the last book, and so you can turn there. The book of Revelation begins as John, who is Jesus' friend and apostle, who's now an old man. He is in exile, like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. The government, the Romans, his Babylon, parked him on an island. John hears a voice that tells him to write down a vision. And then we read this. Then I turned to see the voice that was speaking to me. And on turning, I saw 7 golden lampstands. In the midst of the lampstands, one like a son of man, clothed with a long robe and with a golden sash around his chest. The hairs of his head were white, like white wool, like snow. His eyes were like a flame of fire. His feet were like burnished bronze. And I want you to see that John sees the same Son of Man that Daniel will see in Daniel chapter 10. This is how Daniel describes what he sees in Daniel chapter 10. His body was like beryl, his face like the appearance of lightning, his eyes like flaming torches, his arms and legs like the gleam of burnished bronze. And then John adds this detail of the Jesus that he saw, that his legs are like burnished bronze, refined in a furnace. Why that detail? Why does John need to see that? Because John is in his own furnace. It's prison exile. It's that moment in John's life where Babylon seemed to have all the power. And he needed to remember that a long time ago, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were thrown into a furnace for resisting the idolatry of the day, and God was with them. And then he needed to remember that a short time ago, Jesus was thrown into the fiery furnace of the cross. And it looked like God was not with him. And then Jesus rose again, having passed through the fiery trial, so that John in his Babylon and believers in every Babylon will trust the God who saves because he has gone through his own trial for us. So the point of Daniel 3 is often that in these trials God is with you, and that is true. But I think we can move the needle one more click to see that not only is God with you in the trial, but he has gone before you in the trial. And because he has gone before you in the trial, he is eminently trustworthy. He is worth living faithfully for in Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar, just to end the story, answers and says, "Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants who trusted in him, and set aside the king's command, and yielded up their bodies rather than serve and worship any god except their own. Therefore I make a decree. Any people, nation, or language that speaks anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn limb from limb, and their houses laid in ruins. For there is no other God who can rescue in this way. This is the word of the Lord.